ready? No, start.
Oh, really? But will one of the judges be like informal retirement or?
Sure.
Just yeah.
Can we get one of these months?
Yeah. Actually, that'd be great. We have like 40.
Recording this on your iPhone.
Yeah.
You just gonna sit there the whole time, like holding it.
Argument nods.
Was that recorded?
Like that.
The part where I was asking you if it was. All right, you guys ready?
Yep. Not just record.
Great. First, obviously, huge congratulations to our opponents for getting this far, and thank you so much for the judges for being here. We affirm today's resolution, which is that in U.S. elections, money is more important than message. So first, this is a fact round, which means that it's a question of whether we can prove it true or false, that empirically speaking, money is more important than message in U.S. elections. Couple definitions, obviously, money is money that's spent to influence the outcome of an election, things like campaign donations, super PACs, etc. And then message would refer to what the candidates are advocating for. So if we can prove that the amount of funding that a candidate receives is more important than what kind of message they promote and whether people like that message, then we will win the debate. And so obviously the weighing mechanism would just be preponderance of evidence about who can prove the resolution either true or false. Our first contention is the influence of money in politics. And we'll first note that the Citizens United ruling in 2010 has basically jump-started the influence of politics. This was a ruling where a group that was opposed to Hillary basically sued for the right to spend as much as they wanted on elections without having to disclose their donors. And in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court ruled in 2010 that was exactly what they could do. And the consequence of this is that corporations and unions can now spend unlimited amounts of money in elections. And furthermore, super PACs no longer have to disclose their donors, which means that they can fund elections to an unlimited extent, and no one will ever know who was behind their campaigning. As a result of this, 66% of all campaign donations that influence an election are in amounts of larger than $200, which is mostly donations by very wealthy people trying to influence the outcome, as opposed to donations by everyday people concerned about the message that the candidate is promoting. One particular example that I'll cite here, which I think is a really interesting one, is the example of Bruce Rauner, the current governor of Illinois. This is a guy who was elected last year. He has a personal net worth of $500 million and basically called on the influence of himself, a couple of his wealthy friends, and the elite of Illinois to use their money and power to force him into influence in Illinois, despite the fact that no one in Illinois really supports his policies, and the results of that have been disastrous. In particular, a man named Kenneth C. Griffin, whose net worth is even larger than Rauner, was a huge financier of his candidacy, and they also organized a network of donors across the state of Illinois who were giving thousands, sometimes millions of dollars to his campaign and allowed him to defeat a candidate that by all measures had policy positions more in line with the ones supported by the people in that state. And the impact of that was that there have been significant cuts in essential services in Illinois. And Illinois has been driven basically pretty far to the right, despite the fact that Illinois itself is a very liberal state. But the influence of power alone and the influence of Bruce Rauner and his wealthy friends basically drove the state into the hands of a conservative government that doesn't represent its interests. And this is one example of the same kind of thing that's happening across the United States with other kinds of groups, and that's leading to money to be more important than message in U.S. elections. Our second contention is that even if message were important, people don't know enough to judge between messages, which means that message is unable to influence the outcome. We'll give a couple empirics on this. First, Time Magazine yearly does a survey where they have U.S. citizens take the citizenship test. And the citizenship test asks basic kinds of questions like, what is the Constitution? Who is the Vice President of the United States? How does the First Amendment work? 38% of the people in this test, 38% of the people in this Time survey failed that test, even though they themselves are born as American citizens. It's kind of absurd. But also, if you look at some of the particular questions that they got asked, it's even crazier. For instance, the vast majority of the people in this survey didn't know how many justices there were in the Supreme Court. The answer is 9. And most of them didn't even know who the Vice President of the United States was Joe Biden. Another example I would say, the further problem with this is that part of how people manage not to know certain facts is through the influence of ideology. That liberals tend to believe one certain thing, conservatives tend to believe another thing, and what they think tends to correlate a lot more with how they identify ideologically than necessarily with anything about the facts of the case itself. The consequence of all of this is that if people don't even know how the facts work, then the message themselves, the message of the candidates, couldn't have any influence because people will never know what the candidate's message is, which means the only thing that can influence the outcome of these elections is money. Because if people aren't even informed enough to decide between two messages, then the message of the candidate could never win the election. Yeah.
So if citizens don't really understand the messages being put forward, why are there individual citizen sponsorships or supporters of individual candidates?
Did I say no citizens do that? Particularly on the fringes, in fact, the people who donate money tend to be the most ideologically informed, but that's not the majority of the population, and they get outvoted by the people who don't know how the issues work. The particular problem, in fact, is that another empiric on this issue of ideology, which is that when you survey people about basic facts about things like has unemployment declined or increased, or things like that, the answers that they give change dramatically depending on which party they're from. For instance, did unemployment decline or increase under Reagan? Most liberals say it didn't. Most conservatives say it did. It's the same thing. It's just a matter of how facts get distorted by ideology. Sorry, no more time. Which means that the messages themselves have become irrelevant because they're just entrapped in this web of ideology. However, a third contention has to do with empirics. And the first empirical cite is that 95% of the candidates who outspent the other opponent in their election in the House and Senate, 95% of them won their election. Which is to say that if you just look at the statistics about like how much money one candidate got versus another, if the total is larger for one candidate, 95% of the time that candidate won. And the consequence of this is that when issues come up where moneyed interests have a say, where moneyed interests favor one side over the other, sorry, no more questions, then the side with more money almost always wins. For instance, take a look at the issue of gun control. Congress has received about $240,000 in donation in support of gun control and about $5.6 million against. Guess what? There hasn't been significant change on gun control. On the issue of food guidelines for elementary schools, it's $2.2 million in favor, $51 million against. Guess what? There haven't been any new food guidelines. I think the most dramatic is what's called the CISPA, which is a law that recently passed intended to basically create new restrictions on kind of the way that internet companies are required to give data to the NSA, etc. $605 million in favor, $4.3 million against. Guess what? The CISPA passed. And because the individual congressmen themselves almost always win when they get more money, they end up becoming beholden to these interests themselves that the money care about, which means that the whole election process is rigged to make those with more power and more influence do better. I'll conclude by talking about a paper that was recently released from Princeton by two researchers named Gylens and Page, who studied basically the influence of who tends to get policy wins. And their conclusion was that in no case do the preferences of average citizens have a causal connection with the actual outcome of what happens in policy debates. In 1,900 cases that they studied, when people had to decide between two policy alternatives, the best predictor of which one was going to win was always the one that had more money behind it, that had more interest groups behind it. Money is more important than message. We urge you to affirm.
So we're gonna just start off on their case, move on to our case, basic stuff.
How many
Judges?
sheets? How many sheets do you think we need for your next case?
One, probably.
Okay.
Judges? Opponents?
Yeah.
Adam?
Yeah.
Alright, so we'll start right now. So basically, just gonna go over their case first. The first thing they talk about is just the framework of the debate today, and that's pretty much uncontested for the most part. Yes, we understand it's a fact debate. We agree with their definitions of money and message. That's perfectly fine. As for preponderance of evidence, that's fine, so long as we understand that, just the amassing of evidence really isn't enough. We need to make sure that we understand the logical links between the evidence and the arguments, because what we'll find once I get into their case a little further is that that's a little bit lacking. All they do is say statistics are, causal to these results, right? And we're going to show you that that's not necessarily the case. Now, the first thing they talk about is Citizens United. Basically, they talk about the fact that now corporations are allowed to spend unlimited amounts of money on elections, right? And now that's a problem. And essentially, because corporations can now spend as much money as they would like on elections, that somehow means that money is now more important than the message itself. Now, what I fail to see in their case is, any evidence as to why, at least with this corporation specifically, as to how the money itself is the actual reason that these people have won the elections. Now, when we get to our case, we'll cross-apply some of the counterexamples we have, and we'll show you that it's not necessarily true that just having more money is going to equate to a higher rate of victory, right? And so then he talks about the fact that now 66% of donations are above $200. First off, there's really no impact from that, right? Yes, we understand that corporations are donating a lot of money. What we fail to understand is the link between that and why it equates to victory. What we see is causality, not necessarily, correlation. What we need to see is causality, and they haven't really provided that to us yet. But right now, I have a question. Yes.
What do you say about all the examples and empirics we cite in our third contention, all of which are cases where the influence of money has led to policy outcomes and election outcomes turning towards those who are wealthier?
Well, what I already said is that we'll get into that in my actual case where we're going to cross-apply it. So Give me a minute, right? So now they talk about the idea of like Rayner, right, and how basically he used his, affluence and all the money that he had essentially to win the election. And one thing that he said in his speech that like kind of destroys this argument is the fact that he said the majority of people don't support his policies. If the majority of people didn't support his policies at some point, how did he get elected into office? Like, that's my question, right? Because at the end of the day, spend all the money you want. At some point, people have to vote. And if he's going to go up here and say that the majority of people didn't support his policies, then how would he have gotten into office, right? It's not like they're literally bribing voters to vote a certain way. What we need to understand is that at some point, those policies were supported by the majority because in order to win the election, he had to be supported by the majority. That's how that's how it works in our political process. Now, in second contention, he basically says people don't know enough facts in order to decipher the message and understand the message, and therefore this equates to money mattering more than the message. The first example he talks about is that, yes, it is very shameful that a lot of citizens in our country can't pass a citizenship. However, memorizing facts is very different than understanding concepts of what laws are going to affect you. Even if I don't know, how many justices we have on the Supreme Court, I know for a fact how I feel about the results of the impact of, all the legislation that presidents are putting forward. If someone says they're going to raise the minimum wage, I understand what that means to me, and I understand whether or not I like that, regardless of, how much trivial information I have about the history of our country. Yes.
Do you think that someone who doesn't know who the vice president is has a detailed understanding of the economics of raising the minimum wage?
They don't need to have a detailed understanding of the economics of raising the minimum wage to realize like what that impact will have on their life personally. Because honestly, what that impact is alone contestable, right? Like, yes, we understand that there's a lot of likely things that could occur with the raising minimum wage, but there isn't an absolute, first of all, that's disputable at best. But a person understands what it means to them if all of a sudden their minimum wage goes up to $15 per hour and then they make a decision based off of that. You don't need to be an economist to be a voter, right? Like, what they're claiming voters need to have for messages to have value is a little bit absurd and like, kind of abusive, right? So additionally, what we find is that they talk about how 95% of people who outspent other candidates won the election. Now, again, I'm going to talk about this in my case as to how that's a correlation, not necessarily a causation, because of all the examples we have of where that isn't necessarily the case. But overall, what we need to understand is like the link with the message. That's a really huge thing. Like not understanding trivial information about our country, old information, things like that, doesn't equate to not understanding what a president's policy is going to do for you when you vote for them. Right? So now let's move on to our first contention, right? This is the idea essentially, well, it's our only contention, it has sub-points within it, but this is basically the idea that money is not the deciding factor in elections. So the first one is the idea of what happens when you have money with a bad message, right? You can have all the funding you want, but if you have a bad message or a message that isn't supported by the people, it doesn't matter how much funding you have, how much ads you have, how much publicity you have, people aren't going to vote for you if they don't like the message you're putting forward. That's kind of just how it works. Now we're going to go in, a couple cases. We're going to talk about past elections, and we're also going to talk about the president. So what we see right now is that Carly Fiorina is one of the most well-funded Republican candidates that is losing the polls consistently. There are candidates with less funding as of right now who are, leading in the polls against her. What we find is that because of the fact that she has a message, because of the fact that people don't like the way she comes across when she speaks, they're not supporting her in the polls. So that pretty much shows that you can have funding all you want, but if your message is bad or if your message doesn't support a certain demographic, you're not going to get support. That's simply how it works. Additionally, what we find is that with Mitt Romney, who outspent every candidate in the 2012 election, he lost, right? Additionally, what we find is that Rick Perry in the majority vote essentially almost tied with Mitt Romney, yet spent only $30,000 on his ad campaign, whereas Mitt Romney at the very end had spent $62 million. Right? So, if he nearly tied with Mitt Romney, spending a fraction of the money, it seems rather clear that the message is, pivotal in getting support from people, not just the money. So you can spend all the money you want to get publicized, but if what you publicize isn't good, you're not gonna win. That's how it's been working, that's how it does work, right? In addition, what we find is the second idea is that a message without actual funding or without this, supreme funding from corporations that I'm talking about also gets results. So what we find is that, Bernie Sanders, right, this is a pretty good example. Bernie Sanders has funding only, basically exclusively from people with $200 or under, yet he is very, very well funded and is, second in terms of polls on the Democratic side of the debate today. What we find is that it's also the case with Tom Golisano, who was outspent by other voters, Linda McMahon and Steve Forbes. Overall, what we find is that that's not the deciding factor. The message itself is very pivotal because if you have a bad unsupported message with a ton of funding, people aren't going to vote for you, and the same works the other way. So basically, the reason these statistics exist on their case, right, is the fact that people who attract funding do so because they also happen to attract voters. The reason they attract so much funding is because the ideologies that they're putting forward attract voters. And this also happens to be, believe it or not, the beliefs that corporations go with as well. Regardless of the fact that they're not individual people, corporations also have political ideologies. And this is the reason that they attract this funding, because basically candidates are putting forth the ideologies that attracts this kind of support and the funding that comes with it. So overall, what we find is that you can't have a winning election with money but not a message, and that's why it's more important.
Give me 1 second, I'm gonna think of quiet music.
Okay.
The music outside.
Hey, guys, I love the music, like music is down to today.
I don't think he really is.
Thank you.
He's not really getting this on video.
You don't really like music.
The song that they were playing I was okay with. The song they're on now I wasn't that big on. It's also just kind of courtesy. Like if you're gonna shut someone down, be nice to them.
Alright, is everyone ready? Judges? Alright, I'm going to be going over the neg case and then the app case. Or actually, framework, then neg.
Framework.
Yeah. Alright, time begins now. I once again strongly affirm today's resolution. Just to briefly go over framework, my opponents brought up that we should look at logic as well. Sure, we can look at logic as well as evidence, but the overall thing we must be judging on is who can better prove their side with both logic and evidence. We believe this is perfectly fine for today's debate, so jumping straight into the negation team's case. Their first point was talking about, or the first and only point was talking about how money does not decide elections. Their first subpoint was talking about how if a candidate has a bad message, then voters won't like them and they won't vote for them. But the simple empirics state that even if voters don't like the message, they will still vote for that person because they do not know. Now, this sounds very illogical because most of the people in this room are educated. We know. But a lot of the voters in America do not, which means they're voting for candidates without actually knowing what they stand for, without actually knowing what their message is. They are voting for these candidates because they get the most visibility. This visibility comes from money. People can see Trump ads all over the place. They can see things critiquing Trump all over the place because he has a lot of money and he has a lot of media coverage. People who are voting for them might not even know what all of his messages are. What they know is that they see him and they know who he is. That is one of the most important things in presidential as well as other elections, and is more important than actually knowing what the message is, as the empirics brought up in our third point prove as well. Yes?
What is the inherent purpose of funding in a presidential or any kind of election?
The funding is usually from wealthy donors who want to advance their own interests and believe that if they give the politician enough money, the politician will do exactly what they want them to do, which is empirically proven to be true. Now, the next thing they brought up was talking about how Fiorina is well funded, but is not a leading candidate. First of all, almost all of the Republicans have a very, very similar message. This makes it almost irrelevant that they are choosing other Republicans over her when she already has money. It is a simple fact, her ads are not as well placed as anyone else. Her money is not being used in an effective manner. It is not her message. People aren't saying, oh, Carly Fiorina is stupid, so I'm not going to vote for her. She's almost exactly the same as every single other Republican. Her message is not why she does not have this support. Thus, this example clearly falls. The next thing they brought up was how Romney had a lot of money but lost, as well as the fact that Rick Perry spent far less and was almost the same. Once again, we must bring up the fact that presidential elections are not nearly as important as my opponents seem to think they are. In fact, they're nearly entirely inconsequential. Let's give you an example. We have a Democratic president right now, but a lot of the policies our government is passing are far more Republican. Why? Because the Congress, House, and the Senate control most of our government. The president can sit there and can try to veto things, but they cannot make a lot of policies that impact a lot of people. So we see that while in a couple of cases money might have helped or might not have helped, we see overall that it is the congressional elections that are impacted the most by money. These are the ones that make up the pure number of the elections and are the most important elections. I'm sorry, not right now. So we see overall that it is people who have the money to get themselves out there who are the ones winning, especially when we look at Congress. Now, the next thing they brought up is that of Bernie Sanders and how he's currently second in the Democratic polls and yet doesn't have a lot of money. First of all, there are not very many Democratic candidates. It is not particularly hard to be second in the polls. Second of all, 95% of all minority Democrats would vote for Hillary Clinton over Bernie Sanders. 95%. So while Bernie Sanders may be second, it is clear he is not winning. His message, while it may appear to some white Americans, is not getting him out there. 95% of these voters are voting for Hillary Clinton. And guess what? Hillary Clinton has far more money. She has far more money, far more visibility, and she is much more known. They bring up at the end that people get money because they attract voters. No. Politicians get money because the people giving it, mostly rich, wealthy donors, think that they can get their way if that politician gets elected. As my partner said, 66% of donations are greater than $200. So we see the majority are coming from these wealthy voters who want their way in the elections. And again, as I'll get into in our own case, we must look too at policy outcomes, not just who wins, but which actual policy outcome is winning out in the end, regardless of the person that wins the election. Now to move into the affirmative case. I'm sorry, I really don't have time. They bring up that there's no evidence that money is the reason for this success. First of all, the empirics we brought up in our third point prove precisely that. Prove that 95% of candidates who outspent their opponents, regardless of their respective messages, won. That looks like pretty strong evidence that it is the money and not the message. They brought up then that there's no impact as these donations and money control in the elections. Actually, there is. We see that the vast majority of Americans are against things like no background checks, which we currently have. We see that they're against cigarettes, and yet Congress has done nothing. Why? Because they got a ton of money from the NRA and from cigarette companies. These companies have far more money electing their own candidates and thus can influence them later. So regardless of the people's views, it's not happening. They then brought up that if people aren't for policies, they won't get elected or they shouldn't get elected. That's exactly the point. The example we brought up, people knew what they themselves supported. They didn't know what the candidates they voted for supported. They voted for this, the Illinois governor without knowing what his policies were, without knowing that they contradicted him because he had money and he was visible. That proves that money is more important. As for our second point, talking about how even if the message is important, we can't judge, people can't judge it, so it doesn't really have an influence. They brought up just that memorizing facts is not the same as knowing. But the problem is they don't have that knowledge. They don't have the basics they need to be able to decide. As well as you can extend the argument my partner made about how liberals overwhelmingly say unemployment went down, conservatives said it went up. Their ideology affects their views. So their views are not particularly accurate nor relevant. And again, the empirics, again, are extended, with the policies happening that have money, and the people who have money getting elected. For all these reasons, I strongly affirm.
Thank you.
So just as an off-time wrap, I'll first be going over the framework and links, then app case, net case, what?
Sweet.
Alright, so everybody ready? Opponents?
Yeah.
Katie?
Yep.
Alright, let's get started. Hello, my name is Adam Pepper, and I'm the second speaker for the nation here today, so let's go ahead and jump right into this and talking about the framework of the debate here today. We've agreed on the definition, so essentially what this is coming down to is how each side links to what the topic is at hand. So let's go ahead and first talk about the weighing mechanism of this round here today, how we're essentially putting focus on two different ideas. We need to focus on evidence as well as logic. So though evidence is a huge part, and we use evidence in both sides of this debate here today as examples, counterexamples, etc., we also have to look towards the logic behind why these things, or why there's a correlation between money, message, and winning. And that is what we're going to do for you right now, provide you that link. So what the affirmation brings to you here today is that money is winning. Now, what they don't provide to you is the link between those. What they bring to you is examples of the winning afterwards. That they tell you is that these people had more money and they won. That is correlation without giving you the causation behind it. And that is the link that they are missing here on the affirmation side. And that is the link the neg is going to provide to you right now. What this link isn't necessarily the money itself, but the link connecting winning and money is the message put forward. And that is what we like to elaborate more when we get into the neg case. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and go into the first idea, which is essentially that money influences individuals. They bring up the Citizens United case, and essentially saying that by people giving more money, that is the ideas, and those are the people they support that are getting out there. In the first speaker's speech, he said, and I quote, "Those who understand are the ones who are giving out the donations." That was his response to the POI I asked. So those individuals who are well informed, who understand the messages, are the ones who are donating to these individuals. So the donations directly stem from the message that they are supporting. What we bring to you is saying that there is no case where someone has had a lot of funding and a horrible message. But we can bring to you cases where there has been little funding with a great message. Though Bernie Sanders may be second, that does not mean he cannot become president in the end. Yes, I'll take your question.
Sure. So you misquoted me. You said that I said those who understand donate. No. What I said is those who are polarized donate. What I'm saying is you're misrepresenting the idea that everyday people donate, whereas really the people who donate tend to be the very wealthy and the ideologues, which means it doesn't represent American people at all.
But let's go ahead and talk about your full idea of the money. I'll be addressing that right now. What our opponents are telling you is those who are trying to influence the elections, those who are trying to donate, are those who are ideologically sound, those who are comprehensive and understanding of the message. They say to you themselves that the average person who doesn't understand and can't pass a citizenship test isn't the one who's donating. So that money comes from those who understand the message. That's where Super PAC funding comes from. That's where individual donations come from. Because in order to put your money into something, that is something that you support. You would not throw your money at something you do not understand. Not at this time, please. So now let's go ahead and go into this idea behind the link of facts versus policy understanding. So what we see here is this is not a debate about what happens with lobbying after elections. What we are specifically talking about in this resolution is the influence on elections to the general public and how that affects them, what the message is. We are not talking about after-election lobbying. We are not talking about differences in the Senate and Congress and how they relate to political parties. What we are purely focusing on is how these individuals get elected, and that is what we need to talk to, and that is how we are going to address the third contention of empirics with our counterexamples in ours. So let's go ahead and first get started in the idea we are trying to present to you here today, is that you cannot have money without a message, but you can have a message without money. So what we see is if we think of money like an umbrella and the message like rain, when it rains, you get the money, you get the umbrella out, and that is what you use to protect yourself. But there's no point in having an umbrella when it's sunny outside, when there's no message to have that umbrella for. Though it may seem comical, this message is true, and what we are going to bring to you in our counterexamples we have here today, of the idea between Fiorina. Though she may not be spending her money wisely, and she isn't like every other Republican, I'll get your question in just a second, what we see is that her message is what is causing her to fail. It's not the fact that she doesn't have enough ads or billboards or posters out there. It's people do not like what she has to say. And that's an example of when a bad message does have the money and doesn't come through. Yes?
So I don't want to be pedantic, but if the umbrella represents a good message and the money is rain, doesn't that mean that people with good messages have the money bounce off of them and go somewhere else?
No, that's not what the message means. What I'm trying to tell you is that one is mutually exclusive to the other, though I do find that funny. So let's go ahead and talk about the real issue we're trying to bring forward to this debate here today, and the fact that you cannot have the message without, or you cannot have the money without the message, but the message without the money. So let's go ahead and go into the more examples that we have. Though they say we need to focus a lot more on other elections, not the presidential elections. My partner brings up to you the Meg Whitman, Tom Callahan, Steve Forbes, all individuals who did not have the funding that their competitors had, but were elected into office through the Senate and in through the House of Representatives. And what we see in the more large scale in the current election is we have Mr. Bernie Sanders. Though he is not winning the election, he does not accept donations over $200. Where does that sound familiar, ladies and gentlemen? Well, the statistic brought up to you by the affirmation is that 66% of donations are over $200. But what we see here in the election here today, with Bernie Sanders, who is not accepting donations over $200, he is still breaking through the polls and coming up and catching up on Hillary Clinton. So to tell us that money is the sole factor behind why these individual elections is simply not true, because of the evidence we provided for you here today. For every example of correlation without causation, we have correlation and causation behind why these individuals are getting elected. What we see is it is the message that comes first. An individual is not supported by a super PAC or an individual if that message is not elaborated on. What we see is that when individuals have their funding doubled or halved, whatever it may be, if they do not have that message, their voting turnout, their voting population is so insignificant it doesn't matter. What we see are individuals who put the message forward. Mitt Romney spending over $68 million more than Barack Obama or any other individual in the campaign trail still lost the election due to ideology. What we see is the example of Rick Perry and Santorum versus Romney in the initial election. Those individuals who have the ideology are the ones who get the money. So message comes before money, and money is just an actor. Thank you.
Basically just their world, our world, and then clarifying some things before I do that, weighing it all. Yeah. Judges, opponents, Adam.
Yep.
All right. So the first thing that I'm going to talk about before I go into like weighing each side for you today, Judge, is that I'm just going to clarify 6 things, unfortunately, that seem to be pretty confusing around today, right? So now let's talk about the idea of causality versus correlation, right? What we have on their side is them essentially saying, look, like these 95% of people who happen to outspend are the ones winning the election. And what we're still looking for, and what we still haven't heard from them, is the link as to why the money is a factor. What we basically got from their second speaker when this happened was a repetition of the statistic and the fact that it occurred. Great. I still don't see the link. We came up here and responded with the fact that the reason they got that funding in the first place is because somebody supported the message that they had. What we're saying is that you cannot have this money come out of nowhere simply because in order to get funding from anybody, you have to have a message that's supported by someone. They still didn't give us that link. They just repeated the statistics. So at that point, like, you don't really see any causality, just a correlation, right? So in addition, let's talk about the second thing, which is the idea of like election support funding. That's what this resolution's about. A lot of the impacts that they're trying to draw come from policies that are being passed by congressmen, being passed by politicians after they're into office. What we need to understand is that after office policy, like the legislation being passed and lobbying is a very, very different thing, and that could be an entire separate debate, right? We're talking about election support funding alone simply because we couldn't try to encompass all that in one debate, right? Like the lobbying that occurs once someone is in office and that influence is a completely different debate. Like they can't really draw impact from that because it's not within the resolution of election funding. So yeah, that's actually the second and third thing. I kind of combined them. So fourth is the idea that like what they stand for with candidates, right? Like basically what's happening is that we've already supported multiple times the idea that in a lot of cases you can have a message and get success with the message alone without the actual funding. And overall, what we find is that there is no success for a candidate if all they have is money, but not a well-supported message. And we'll go into that a little bit more. And then that basically that applies to corporations as well. And then the final thing that I want to clarify is the issue with Carly Fiorina, right? Now she talks about the idea that she didn't use her money wisely. And that's why, they just say, trust us, that's the case. She's not using her money correctly. She's not well advertised. She's spending the money, but not in a good way. I honestly find it highly unlikely, and unless they have a specific reason, that Carly Fiorina, with all the money she has, couldn't find people who are good at advertising and can advertise correctly. All they tell you is that that's what happened. She's not what up. Okay.
Okay. No new arguments allowed in parliamentary debate. The argument that Carly Fiorina has just so much money that she would always be able to hire someone who could come up with a good strategy, and that therefore it's impossible that she spent her money wrong, is a new argument that should have come out in an earlier speech, because we have less time to answer it in our final speech.
Okay, so just as my quick response, my partner asked about this in a POI, and he addressed it in his speech. I'm just expanding upon it in the final speech.
Up to the judges.
Starting time again. 3, 2, 1. So, now with all of that being said, with that being clarified, let's just talk about their world, right? The idea of money being more important. Basically, what we find is that their main statistic, the main thing that they could possibly win off of, is the 95% of people who are outspending are essentially winning the elections. What we respond with, of course, is the idea that he talked about in his last speech at the very end, which is the statistic saying that basically, when a person holds all factors constant other than the funding, right, it has a very insignificant impact. The specifics we had, of course, was that it was basically a 1% change in the popular vote in elections, and that was a study that he brought up in the end of his speech, right? And essentially what we're telling you is that if you hold all other factors constant, that the money alone isn't enough to change things. What we're telling you with that evidence specifically is that the correlation is just that. There's a lot of factors that change along with the changing in funding in the real world. However, when you hold that constant, and you hold everything constant except for the funding, there isn't a lot of change in support.
Stop your time. This is an entirely new argument brought up in the last speech. He's trying to say that his partner said it. I don't have it anywhere on my flow that he made any sort of argument that it was this insignificant a difference based on money. They just said that the money depended on the message.
Sorry, can you just really quickly summarize the argument that just happened?
Yeah. The argument that they're making right now that it is extremely insignificant for money and that everything controlled it would only be 1% and thus it doesn't matter is an entirely new reframing of their argument.
Okay.
Okay, so granted, it wasn't given extensively in his speech. It was at the very end of it, I'll give him that. But he did bring this up in his speech. I'm just expanding upon the fact that he said when all other factors are held constant, that the change in the vote is insignificant, with the money being the only thing that changes.
In your opinion, was the 1% number given?
It was not given.
I don't think he said the 1% out loud, but he did say that the change was insignificant. So you can disregard the 1% if you would like. Yes.
Okay.
Up to the judges.
Sure. So yeah, the specific dropped. That's fine. 3, 2, 1, right? So, okay, now with that being handled, let's move on to the idea of what happens when you have a message, right? And essentially what we have on our side. So what we have on our side is the support of basically Bernie Sanders has, ample support from the country. Yes, there are people who don't support him. We understand that without the funding that they're talking about, without the funding that they say is so essential to winning any sort of election or being successful in an election. In addition, we told you that as the results, people who actually did win in the past, something they chose not to respond to, they only talked about Bernie, was Meg Whitman, Tom Golisano, Linda McMahon, and Steve Forbes, all of whom were outspent by the candidates that they beat into office. They didn't respond to that. They only talked about Bernie Sanders and how, oh, well, he's not winning the election. Awesome. The rest of our examples, actually, that's what happened. So basically, like, the key principle here that we're discussing is the fact that when you only have funding, if you don't have support from someone, if you're not representing some demographic, you're not going to get any sort of funding because your ideals aren't representing anybody. Right? Now, in response to the idea that they discussed with, people just not understanding what people are supporting, I just somehow don't buy that because of the fact, if someone says this policy is going to increase the minimum wage or something like that, me as a citizen, me as a minimum wage worker, I understand what that's going to mean to me, and in my opinion, that's what's going to happen as a result of it, regardless of the funding. Now, whether or not the person changes their policies later based on lobbying is, again, off topic because we discussed it in the resolution today. We're not talking about lobbying once a person's in office, but we're talking about election support funding because those are two different things. Whole different thing could occur from that. So overall, what we find is that in the very end, when you really look at what happens in the real world, a message can win an election and often does win an election when funding isn't present. However, funding alone does not exist because of how significant a message is, because of how significant it is for any candidate to support some sort of demographic in order to get funding in the first place. And with that in mind, I urge a negative ballot.
Great. So the order is an overview, followed by the affirmative case and the negative case. The overview is kind of long, so you might want another sheet or something.
Okay.
Okay, or another tab full. It's your special.
Look, the app team telling me what to not.
All right. You guys good?
Yep.
Obviously, again, huge congratulations to everyone. I think it's been a great debate. Remember the weighing mechanism. Do we prove the resolution true? Do we prove the resolution false? Now, they frame this as, can money win an election without a message? Can a message without a supported message? Can a message that people like win an election without money? In both cases, we will win that our side of this resolution is true. For instance, Bruce Rauner won the election in Illinois despite the fact that his message was universally not the one that Illinois citizens wanted, because they simply didn't know his message, and the ads that were blanking the airwaves made them be aware of him over the other candidates, which means that he won due to name recognition. Can a message win without money? Probably not. Their only example is Bernie Sanders, who, as you will note they've conceded, isn't winning. And the fact that 95% of minorities oppose him, because most minorities in the Democratic Party aren't as liberal as Bernie Sanders is, means that he's not going to win the election. And so their only example of an election that could potentially be won by a message without money is an example of an election that, guess what, hasn't been won yet. That brings me to my two voting issues. First, money is critical to election. It's more important than messages. They've conceded that 95% of congressmen, that 95% of congressional races where one side has more money than the other, the side that has more money tends to win. They say there's no logic behind this. The logic is you see someone's face, you know who they are, you vote for them. Especially in a scenario where people don't know what these candidates' stances are, because most people are not as politically informed as they might think they are, then that is an indication that name recognition alone is often enough to win. Furthermore, the most important thing to discuss here is not who wins the election. It's not that I voted for face A versus face B. It's about what kinds of things happen in Congress, what kinds of policies pass as a result. And so if the Congresses we pass consistently pass policies in line with business interests, because the business interest made sure that no one is allowed to oppose their interest in the election, then the election process is clearly working for money and not for message. But second, and this is the argument they really mishandle, message counts for nothing because people don't know enough to evaluate those messages, and they don't know what the messages are in the first place. You've conceded all of our examples about how people not only don't know anything about elections, about the American political system, their understanding of the system is heavily colored by which party they come from, which means that the message of the candidate themselves becomes a side point because no one knows what the message is, no one knows how to evaluate it. Now their response is to just simply be incredulous, like, oh, I can't believe this, like, look at me, I know about the minimum wage, everyone else must too. The problem is not everyone is informed to the same extent about these issues. And furthermore, like, the minimum wage is a pretty complex thing. Like, most people, even if they have a stance on an issue, it's not a stance that's particularly informed by the economics on it, whatever, which means that generally speaking, they're going to vote for the person they know, not based on a detailed evaluation of the policy stances these people advocate. Go to the affirmative case. Their only real argument here is that those who understand donate, and that donation reflects messages. A couple problems with this. First, they've conceded that most of the donations simply come from people who are more wealthy, and that 66% of them are in quantities greater than $200, which means that it's not about being understanding, it's about being wealthy. If you're poor and you understand the issues, you cannot influence the election, which means even if the people who are influencing the elections know something, the reason they have influence is not because they know something, it's because they have money. And thus money is more important than message. This 66% stat is critical. But let's get on to the example of Bruce Rauner, which is something that they don't really grapple with much. They say that people must have supported him because otherwise he wouldn't have won. They must have supported his policy stances. That's just the problem. They don't know his policy stances. And now that he's doing things like cutting entitlements, cutting basic programs, cutting education in Illinois, which is the exact same thing he was advocating in the election, people are starting to sour on him because they didn't even realize during the election that these were his policies. It's the lack of knowledge that allows money to proliferate, that allows money to control the election. On our second contention about how people don't know anything about politics, they concede most of these arguments. They basically don't talk about this at all in their second speech. Particularly, I think the most important part is this segment about ideology, which is to say that people don't actually know how the election process works. They just fill in what they think the election process does based on which party they identify with, which means that it's not really about message, because a good message is never going to be able to convince someone if they identify with some other party. What matters is name recognition and people being able to get their name out there through the power of ads. Finally, on our third contention, all these conceded empirics matter. Even though this is a debate about logic, the fact that we have so many statistics about things like policy outcomes is critical because policy outcomes should be the first concern. It's not about which face gets elected, it's about what that person does once they get in office. And if the people we're electing consistently favor the interest of money over the interest of everyday people, which is exactly what our examples say, then that means you can affirm today's resolution. On the next case, all the Republicans are very similar. There's not much of a difference in message. The only difference is a matter of money. Clinton is winning over Sanders, which is just another proof that money is what's relevant here. They haven't given you a single example of an election that was won by message without money. We've given you tons of examples where money alone was enough to overcome deficiencies in the message. Obvious vote for the ad. Debate.
Yeah.
Debate. Do you want to say to yourself outside?